Before you wake up, before you pack, before you leave on your trip, we're here, working to make diving safer. Medics, doctors, 24/7 emergency hotline staff, experts who have handled over 10,000 emergency medical evacuations. It's that tireless dedication and expert management of care that give divers confidence to explore freely, to see the world from a new perspective, one that most never experience. Knowing that if there's an emergency, someone will be there to help. Knowing they have a safety organization by their side every step of the way. An organization with a network of the world's best dive medical professionals and recompression chambers. An organization that conducts continuing medical education courses to improve treatment for injured divers. An organization that has spent over 40 years building its reputation for dive safety. At DAN, your health and safety drive everything we do.
All right. Well, good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are in the world. Gareth, thank you for joining us again. I'm looking forward to the talk today. So it seems like we still got a couple of folks joining us, slowly picking up there. I think what I'll do is get the formalities out the way for the moment. And then by that time, I'm sure we'll have most folks join. And then I'll hand over to you. I can see in the chat box there, we got Jacob. He's from South Africa and from a place called Vereniging. Great to have him on board again. Mayat and Scuba, if I'm not mistaken, part of my region. Hi, all Rich from Madison in the US. Okay, great stuff. And who have we got? Yeah, Gareth, Andy. I assume that's somebody you know, Gareth. That's great.
Yeah, he's in Poland. He's one of the candidate instructors. So, yeah, good to see you, Andres.
Okay. All right. So for the folks that are already on online, that's great. We've got Joe from Belgium who's just joined in. That's great. So let me just grab my little slide deck here and get that going. And to kickstart the webinar, just like to welcome everybody. It's great to have all the divers from around the world joining the webinar again. And I really hope you're going to enjoy it. For the folks that don't know me, my name is Morne Christo, and I'll be your host this evening. And I'm from Dan, Southern Africa. I just like to say thanks for making time to join us this evening or afternoon or in the morning, wherever you are. And just thank you for supporting Divers Alert Network. We try and build a safer dive community throughout the world, and it's great to have your support. So the talk topic this evening is learning from unintended outcomes, and Gareth will talk more about that. But before we get started, just a couple of Barebone Basics. I think we're all used to webinars by now, but the platform I'm using doesn't allow you to use your mic and your video. But if you do have any comments now or during the presentation, or just like to say, how's it, and tell us where you are in the world, either via YouTube or Facebook, you can just use the comment section and just add your details in there, and we'll take it from there. Now, during the presentation, if you do have any questions, just use hashtag and ask followed by your question. That'll help us just sort of find the questions amongst all the different comments far easier. Generally, Gareth will, do his presentation and address the questions afterwards. But if there's a natural stop and there are any questions, I'm sure we'll address those as we go along. As usual, the replay will be available tomorrow via the Dan YouTube channel, and for this time also via Facebook. For the folks that registered via email, you'll receive an email with the replay link tomorrow, plus a whole bunch of free resources from Dan and all Gareth's links to his website, his education platform, and so much more. So for the folks that didn't register by email, that's fine. I'll post all those notes and resources via YouTube as well as Facebook, so that everybody can access and gain access to those resources. Now, just again, thank you for supporting Divers Alert Network around the world. If you haven't joined Dan yet, it's a good time to join today, just before the busy diving season around the world, I guess. So if you'd like to learn about Dan and you are from the Southern Africa region, the best place is to go to our website, which is dansa.org. If you're in the United States, you can go to dan.org. In the European region, it's daneurope.org. And Asia Pacific is danap.org. All right. So to all the active Dan members, thank you for your ongoing support. And if you guys are keen to help grow our channel, you can support it via the Super Chat feature that you can find on YouTube, just around the comment section. So it's a little $sign. You can click on that, decide if you want to donate, how much, and then you can choose a Super Chat or a little sticker, and that then will go towards the channel to help grow it. And if you do that, thank you very much. All right. So I have a free gift for the folks joining us today. And it's the Dan Southern Africa, the December issue of the Alert Diver magazine. All right, so I'll give you access to that in a moment, but it's jam-packed. It's just over 150 pages, filled with a range of different content, not just Dan stuff. So if you'd like access to that, you can grab your mobile devices, scan that QR code, and that'll take you to the page where you can view the magazine online or download it. Or if you prefer reading the more simpler format articles, you can just scroll down on the page and you can open those. So yeah, just scan that code. If you're struggling with a code, don't worry. The link to the magazine will be in the notes sections on Facebook and YouTube, as well as in the email that for the folks that registered by email tomorrow. All right. So for the folks on the YouTube channel, if you haven't subscribed to our channel yet, please hit that subscribe button now so you can stay in tune when we release our weekly content in the short form and every now and again in the longer format like tonight. And if you know of any dive buddies that would be interested in this presentation, I think it's a great time to hit that share button now and invite them to join. You know, the more folks we have on this broadcast, the better traction we can get. And the same goes for the folks on Facebook. Now, after the presentation, if you enjoyed what Gareth had to say, please hit the like button, and that'll help us also get some more eyeballs onto the talk in the replay format. All right, so for the folks that don't know Gareth, in brief, he's the owner and founder of the Human Diver. It's an organization formed to bring human factors, knowledge, experience, and practice from high-risk domains and academia into the sport diving arena. So there's a lot more to say about that, but I'm sure Gareth will talk a little bit about that before he starts his presentation. But I think for the most part, people around the world have come to know the name Gareth Locke, and if not, then you're in for a good time tonight. Just a brief overview of the talk topic again, learning from unintended outcomes, a framework to help learning after diving incidents and accidents. I hope you guys are going to enjoy the webinar. And without any further ado, let's get started. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and hand over to Gareth. Just give me a second here.
Thanks very much, Mornay. And thanks very much for everybody's taking the time to be here this evening or wherever you are. It did make me laugh, Mornay, when you said, yeah, it's going to start the dive season at this time of year. It was like -4 here this morning. So it's... It all depends where you were, and actually, it brings up a really interesting bit about context and the value of why we need to understand some little bits. A little bit about my background for those who don't know me. 25 years in the Royal Air Force as a flight instructor on Hercules transport aircraft. The image on the bottom right, and then in 1999, I learned to dive. But then in 2004-05, I had a couple of close calls and realized that actually the diving industry is lacking in what makes aviation safe. And there's a lot of stuff relating to incidents, accidents, just culture, human factors, non-technical skills, all of these things that aviation takes for granted, diving was missing. And so since then, I started to, well, I put together training programs. I wrote the book Under Pressure that's there, which was published nearly 3 years ago now. 2020, May 2020, released the documentary If Only, as a way of showing people what goes into an accident through the lens of human factors and just culture. So it's looking at what would be quite a simple outcome, and I'll touch on it today a little bit. In terms of my diving, about 800 dives, open circuit, advanced trimix, and closed circuit on a JJ CCR as well. But in April this year, I had a bit of a health scare, so I've been off diving since then. And there's a blog that I'll make available to Mornay. It just really is about looking after your own health as well, and looking out for the weak signals that are there, things that you think, yeah, that'll be okay, but actually it's not necessarily the case. So fortunately, it turned out all right. I've now got 2 stents in my heart, in the Widowmaker artery, if anybody knows about that one. So I'm all here, and I'm happy about that. So what we're going to talk about tonight, about 50 minutes, so it'll take us up to the next top of the next hour, looking about learning from unintended outcomes, and what does that mean. We're then going to look at this need to understand different perspectives, and why we often find what we're looking for, which we think helps solve the problem, but that's not necessarily the case. There's also a need to look up and out and not down and in, and that might appear to be a bit of an odd phrase, but often the investigations we have look that way, and we look at individuals, whereas actually we need to be looking up and out and looking at the sort of the context, the system, and the scenarios. As an example of that, I showed a short video at a company that I was working with on Tuesday, of an accident on the back of a flatbed truck where they were using a pallet lifter. And I said, so what do you think was the cause of this? And the only 3 responses I got back before I stopped it were all about the individual and their performance, where actually there was a whole bunch more to it. So there's a need to look up and out. Then I'll talk about a general learning process that I've put together, and it's a framework that I'm putting an academic paper together about, is understanding what needs to be put in place to enable learning to happen in the diving industry. It can be applied elsewhere, but predominantly in the diving industry, because that's where I'm focusing my stuff. Then we'll talk about some detailed learning and how we can go about looking at that, and then some real parting thoughts and takeaways, and then questions as we go along. If there's any sort of killer questions that you've got to have me answered right now, if you can put #ask and then stop, so that Mornay can go, Gareth, there's something, and we'll do that. But it's only as a sort of real sort of important bit. Otherwise, I'll take questions at the end. So what does learning mean? That's the first question. And learning involves change. And unfortunately, change is hard. There is a difference between lessons identified and lessons learned. A lesson identified is where you've observed it, you might have written it down, you might have captured that knowledge. And often people think that lesson's identified is actually the learning. Actually, the learning requires us to change. It requires us to take that thing, whatever it is, create a hypothesis that says, if we put that in place, it will make things safer, more efficient, save us money, whatever it is. And then we have to measure or notice the change that's happened. At that point, we have a lessons learned. If we just capture stuff, we have lessons identified. And that's one of the big problems we have, is we have, well, not as much as is in high-risk industries, but in the diving industry, we don't have much data, and the data we do have is often observation rather than change. The other thing is that there are barriers to preventing us learn. We will often find differences in other people's perspectives than in terms of our own. So we should be looking for parallels, not differences. Then the next 2 bits, incidents and accidents. Well, incidents, I ask people, what do you think is an incident? And there is a big variety of outcomes. And that's one of the problems, is we don't have a clear definition of an incident. Often it's about compromising risk and safety. But my view, if I have a free flow cylinder on a 70-odd meter dive and I shut the cylinder down, okay, that's one of those things. But as an open water diver, in 18 meters, the sort of limit of their bit, and they're getting close to the end of the dive, and they have a free flowing cylinder, that's actually probably a little bit more serious in their sense. So there's often this thing about the amount of risk that's involved. Both of those things might have similar learnings, but we don't necessarily see the value in those. Accidents, they're normally fatalities. And the problem with trying to learn from accidents is normally the decision maker is dead. You can't ask them how it made sense for them to do what they did. Incidents, we've got lots of data, we've got the opportunity to capture data, but because we don't have a just culture and we don't have psychological safety within our environment, it's very difficult to get those stories to be told, especially if it involves professionals. Because those professionals, if they talk about things that went wrong, often they can be used as evidence in litigation or something that's happening. So that's, the barriers that are there. And then we've got unintended outcomes. Now, I put that instead of incidents, accidents, mistakes, because unintended outcomes could also be successful outcomes. So incident investigation, and I can't find another word for that, but it's good enough, is not just about the bad stuff that's happened. It's also about the good things. We're trying to understand those. So that brings us on to that first bit of perspectives. Now I'm going to talk about two learning opportunities. Learning opportunity one, which is a rebreather diving incident. And this is the sort of narrative that you would get in social media posts. A student diver entered the water from a dive boat while on a CCR training class. An instructor and 3 other students were present. While waiting to have their stage passed down to them, they appeared to lost consciousness and sank to 40 meters where their body was recovered. Now, there's not a lot of information in there, and that's purposely written that way because this is the sort of stuff that gets shared. And it doesn't help us learning because there's so many things that you could immediately say you thought had happened. And I'm not going to go into those because I want you to think about them as we go through this presentation. You might want to scribble them on a bit of paper in front of you, just so you capture those. And then when we come near the end, we can start to look at actually what happened. So that was a rebreather training class. Next one is taking it to the other end of the scale. An open water diver diving the Galapagos Islands on the 4th dive of the 4th day, where they'd been to 25 to 30 meters, they intentionally surfaced despite having 18 minutes of decompression showing on their computer. They suffered severe DCS and required an emergency evacuation that took 18 hours from surfacing to arriving in a decompression chamber. Now, again, I've put this up here. This is the sort of thing that would appear on social media, and it did nearly 2 years ago now. And I've purposely put some language in here, which is getting you to think in certain ways. And I'm in control of the narrative. And that's something else to consider is when you read narratives or you read reports, what's the purpose of that? Now I'm being a little bit nefarious, a little bit naughty here. I'm writing confrontational language to get you to think a certain way. But that's not, intentional. In many cases, people don't understand the power that language has. So what limits the learning? Invariably, lack of information. We get small snippets, people jump in with their assumptions. And if that is a near miss that somebody's put online, often they get very defensive because they don't want to engage with this because they think, God, if this is how I've just been treated with this, there's very judgmental language, then actually people don't engage. They don't want to share the story, the context that's needed. Then we have 3 groups of biases or 3 bunches here that limit our learning. And I'll talk about one of them in a little bit more detail than the other 2, but outcome and severity bias are quite closely linked. So the more, if we have a bad outcome, we often judge people on that outcome rather than the decision making that came to that. And if we have a severe outcome, we judge them more harshly too. So as an example, if somebody surfaces and they've got 10, 20 bar, 100, 200 PSI in their cylinder, there might be a bit of discussion. And depending on the dive boat you're on, they might turn around and go, well, you've surfaced with gas. Why didn't you dive some more? But, you've got a low gas situation. Now, what would happen if that diver then surfaced with zero gas on the surface? What if they'd run out of gas at depth and needed to do a controlled emergency swimming ascent, or they needed to do a gas sharing ascent? What if they ran out of gas and died at depth? Those incidents may have the same causal and contributory factors, but I can pretty much guarantee that when we have a severe injury or a fatality, people are far more judgmental than they are when a near miss happens. And if there's a supervisor involved, like an instructor, a guide, or a dive master, or a skipper, then actually people start to be more, severe in their judgment as well, because they say they should have done something. They employ these things called counterfactuals: should have, could have, would have, because they know what the outcome is. Linked with this, all three of these actually, is something called the fundamental attribution bias. We often focus on individuals' behaviors and actions and decisions without looking at the context. If I observe Mornay doing something and I think, oh man, what a forgetful guy he is. Wasn't he paying attention to what's going on? Not realizing that actually there was a whole bunch of other stuff going on in his life at that time. And so he wasn't able to pay the right amount of attention. So looking at the context. But if it happens to me, what happens is I look for systems, excuses, stuff that's outside of me that led me to have that accident or incident. I don't look at myself and think, why was it that happened? And then the final one, which is called the hindsight bias, which is very powerful. And that's why I'm going to dig into this. Now, this quote came from Clapham Junction inquiry from a Queen's Counsel, Anthony Hidden. And it said, there is almost no human action or decision that cannot be made to look more flawed and less sensible in the misleading light of hindsight. It is essential that the critic should keep himself constantly aware of that fact. We can join the dots, and that's what this little model talks about, this little framework. And it's taken from a healthcare paper looking at an accident in healthcare and then looking at it from a different perspective. It's called A Tale of Two Stories. So in this case here, I'm a diver. I've got multiple options in front of me. I've got multiple choices. Some of them end up as good outcomes and some of them end up as bad outcomes. And they're sometimes interdependent and linked. But the important thing is we don't know precisely and with high certainty, very high certainty, which is going to definitely end up as an accident. So I'm making the choices to best I can. But on one particular occasion, I have a bad outcome. This adverse event has occurred. And then the observers, it could be, somebody who's locally, as in the location, or it could be online. And all they do is they isolate the choice. Good decision, bad decision, or rather good outcome, bad outcome. And what they don't see is all of the stuff on the left-hand side, and that's context. It's very easy to join the dots going backwards and go, oh, poor decision, poor decision, poor decision. Whereas actually we need to look at this and go, how is it a good decision? How is it a good decision? How is it a good decision? Because people are trying to make good decisions with the best resources and information they've got. Now, this little video just brings it to light. Incidents and accidents are discussed. We get this ability to draw the lines, draw the dots and go, they should have done that, could have done that, I would have done that, as opposed to understanding what the drivers are that's in place. And so we're going to talk about that in a little bit more detail because we need to look at things from different perspectives. And I'm going to talk about a story on that happened in 1973. It's quite emotive, quite a politically charged story, but it happened. So there's no point in denying what's happened that's there. And it's a very powerful story to understand the different perspectives. So 1973, there've been threats against the Israelis from the Egyptians to hijack a jet, or terrorist organizations to hijack a jet, and they were going to crash it into a nuclear reactor. And they started to descend, they got down there, and then, they configured the aircraft. Then all of a sudden, the aircraft pulled up and then started to fly away to the west, back to Egypt. So the military command said, hang on a minute, this can't be a proper, a genuine civilian airline flight, because the crew's primary responsibility is looking after its passengers. Why have they done this? It must be a hijacked aircraft and they're trying to flee. So they authorized the pilots, the fast jet pilots, to fly tracer rounds and to try and basically get them to land. And they ended up hitting the wings, and the aircraft ditched in the desert. And I think there were 110 people killed out of 116 or so on board. And there was, rightly so, huge outcry that military jets had downed a civil airliner in their airspace. And in this similar sort of outcry that happened with the USS Vincennes shooting down a jet in the Mediterranean as well. So what I'm going to use this as a story to say, look, actually, this is the surface story. And it wasn't until they recovered the cockpit voice recorders that they started to understand what was going on. So we need to understand what is the truth. Now, in a physical, mechanical system like this cube that the cylinder is sitting inside and is having two sets of light shine at it, it's very much cause and effect. There is truth. That is a cylinder that has got different colors on it. Now, what the colors are could be different. What your orange and my orange and what my cyan and your cyan might be slightly different. But broadly, we've got probably a strong alignment of what the truth is. And it really does depend on the perspective we're looking at. And so one of the tools that I use that works in diving, but also works in high risk industries, especially when we've got more layers within a system, is showing this Jenga model. So we've got 6 different layers in this, and it's a game or a tool that I use in conferences and presentations. And this Jenga tower, if we start to look down on top of it, we see an intact framework. But actually, things have happened over time. Bricks have been moved, they've been placed elsewhere. And actually, instead of being a solid tower that's intact, we have a whole bunch of gaps that are in there. Now, when somebody is pulling these Jenga bricks out, because that's what the goal is, and they pull the brick out that collapses the tower, often we would focus on that individual and say, you're the reason it failed. You're the one to blame. But actually, there are multiple failures in this. And that's when we're looking at diving as a system, we have to look further than just the person at the sharp end, the proximal cause, who was last to touch it. And we'll talk about some of the factors that come into that in a bit more detail in a second. So, the perspectives that we could take in terms of understanding why diving incidents occur could be from a medical perspective. This is a DAN presentation. It's a medical support and provides some insurance, repatriation, medical evacuation, all sorts of things like that. So most of the older DAN reports were very much about medical issues rather than systems wide. You could take a perspective of an agency. Okay, so who trained them? Who was their instructor? What was the agency? When did they get trained? We could take it from that sort of side. We could say, if it happened on a class, what happened in that class? What is it that we're lacking in terms of our training materials? Or are we just going to say, you know what, they didn't follow the standards, therefore it's their problem? We could have a regulator like the Health and Safety Executive or OSHA in the States. They will have a view of how stuff should be done. They will have a set of procedures and processes and regulations that instructors or dive centers need to follow. Could have a manufacturer's perspective. Was my kit dodgy? Was something happened? Actually, am I opening myself up to problems that we weren't aware of beforehand? The litigation or the defense lawyer will have a perspective. And invariably, they're trying to find somebody to blame, because that's what litigation is. It's about finding somebody who is accountable for the actions. Police and criminal investigations, fortunately, these don't happen very often. The police are normally involved to see if there's any foul play. If there isn't any foul play, then they'll move on. Now, from a criminal investigation, when they are interviewing people, they are trying to find out what happened from their perspective. And often they've got, I'm going to say, an agenda because they want to see whether or not the foul play is true. And so they are in control of the interviews. And people don't say things in a police interview unless they're really asking questions or answering questions. They don't volunteer stuff because they might trip themselves up. So you only really hear one side of a story. And then we have social media. And this is a real double-edged sword. Social media allows us to share stories, to get stuff out there really quickly. At the same time, because people don't understand how errors occur and adverse events occur, they don't understand human performance, they become very judgmental because they match what they think should be happening or should have happened with their own experience. And they're not necessarily putting themselves in the other person's shoes to understand their context. Why did or how did it make sense for them to do what they did? So, if we talk about the diving research that's out there for the causes of accidents and incidents, it talks about here, in most cases, the inquiry ends with establishing the proximal cause of death. Health, mainly, drowning, running out of gas. And we'll talk about those in a little bit more in a sec. In other words, the root cause is most commonly diver error. Well, that may have been true if you look back at even aviation 40, 50 years ago, where you talk about pilot error. What they realize now is that error is a symptom of a weakness in the system of some sort. An error is not a cause. An error is an outcome of something going on. And actually, the causes that we perceive are ones that we construct. So if we go back to those sorts of proximal causes, this was some work done, 2008, then presented in 2011 at the Dan Fatalities Workshop. And they said, I'm trying to think, 43% of fatalities had a trigger of running out of gas. But it didn't tell you why they ran out of gas. Was it distracted, poor planning, equipment that was failed? There are a whole bunch of reasons why people can run out of gas. And just to say that's the trigger, it doesn't help us learn. Because I think most divers know not to run out of gas. So saying to people, pay more attention and don't run out of gas is not going to help us. Now, I spoke to Petard de Noble, one of the authors in this, and he said the reason why, we just don't have the data that happens before that. We don't have the context. And that's what's missing. We need to dig into that. So we go back to this event itself, the different perspectives. So yes, a Libyan aircraft got airborne and they were going into Cairo. Unfortunately, the pilots got lost. They didn't know where they were. The beacons that they were trying to tune into weren't coming up on their systems. So they were flying east and they crossed into Israeli airspace. They were still talking to Cairo. They were 70 miles off route without realizing it. The Cairo approach cleared them to descend. And so they thought, oh, okay, we must be fairly close to Cairo then. So we'll follow the descent down. And that's when the jets thought that, they were descending into an Israeli airfield. So the air traffic control Cairo sector transferred them across to Cairo approach. Oh, cool. We must be really close then. Now, at this stage, the co-pilot noticed the Phantom that was on the right-hand side. And the thing was, he was Libyan, and the captain and the flight engineer were both French. And the captain and the flight engineer were having this conversation in French about trying to sort out the navigation. They weren't listening to the co-pilot, and the co-pilot couldn't understand what was going on. So the co-pilot said to the guys, look, there's jets here. Yeah, whatever. We don't need to follow what they're, they were really, they couldn't understand why the Egyptians had launched to MiG jets, which is what the co-pilot thought they'd got. Now, there was a conversation happened. And then as they descended, they saw this Israeli airfield. It was a military airfield. Now, there is a military airfield in Cairo, and it's Cairo East. And these Libyan pilots, or the two pilots on this Libyan jet, thought that they were flying into the Egyptian military base. They configured their aircraft, they started to go down, they put the gear down, and they went, oh no, wrong place, cleaned the aircraft up, got it, climbed, and then headed off west, because if the military airfield's off to the east of Cairo, Cairo West must be behind us, and we'll turn around. And then it was only right at the end that the co-pilot recognized the Star of David on this F4. And it was like, oh, by which time it was too late. They'd been forced to land in the desert, and they crash landed. And so now when we see using black box data, we can start to see a different story. And there was a presentation I gave 4 years ago at OzTech about black box thinking and the use of reconstructing events from black box data, but that doesn't help us understand the decision-making process that's there. We need to go further than that. Now, one of the things we also got to recognize is who tells the story and who gets to tell the story. Because if you only have one story told, and unfortunately in fatalities, we can't ask that person, we have to create the story ourselves based on what we think or thought would have happened. So if we don't have a just culture in place, it's very difficult for those who are left behind to tell the story because they're afraid of doing so. And I'll talk about blame in a minute. So what we need to be doing is looking up and out, not down and in. So if we're looking at diving incidents, it's not just about the performance on the day at that time. It's also looking at their currency, their competency. What was their experience in this space? When was the last time they dived? Who trained them? Who did quality control on that instructor? And this is one of the things that really frustrates me about the diving industry, but I know why it's there, is that the training agencies isolate themselves from what happens down at the sharp end, at the dive centers and at the as divers themselves, because they say it's not our problem. We give divers training. What they do with that is up to them. The same thing to a certain extent with instructors. We give the instructors the training materials, and it's up to them how to deliver it. Now, there is a quality control, quality management process, but often it's a tick box exercise. Nobody really goes out there and looks to see actually how well are they teaching. And I get there's a burden involved in that. So I know why these things happen. Agencies try to isolate themselves from the risks because if they can separate themselves, they are then no longer liable. I'm not saying I don't understand why it's there. I'm just saying it doesn't help us. So the culture flows down from the agencies, or actually from the community in general, down through the agencies, down to the dive centers, instructors, and down to the divers themselves. If we want to fix things, it's not about fixing individuals. It's about trying to address the system. Because if the same things are happening again, and again, it is not an individual problem. It's a system problem that needs to be addressed. And that's what we need to do, is collect stories, data. And we've got this stuff on the left-hand side. We have these incident reports. But what we've got to do is create connections to see what's likely to happen next, using the experience we have without separating ourselves from it. We've got to say, how does this make sense for that person to do it? And why am I similar? Not, how did it make sense for them to do that? And I'm different and I wouldn't do that. So we collect this stuff in the top, and through synthesis and storytelling, and it's talked about distillation and pattern recognition, we get these nuggets at the bottom. And that's the bit that says, this is how it made sense for this event to occur in the way it did. And that's really what I did with If Only, was interviewing the widow and the dive team to understand how it made sense. And I'd love to get involved in doing something similar for a recreational event, not a fatality, preferably, because then we can speak to the people involved, and also a cave diving event, because the feedback I've had has been fantastic as a way to get that across. A number of you may have seen this animation of the Swiss cheese model. It's a linear cause and effect. Something happens up in the left-hand side, and then it propagates through the system. Each one of those layers is a barrier that tries to prevent the adverse event from occurring. But when those holes line up, we end up with an accident. Now, if I'm down at the sharp end, down the unsafe acts and the red box, I make an assumption about people doing their job properly, that the instructions are going to be safe, the training program is going to be complete, the equipment manufacturers done their job properly, the certification agencies have done their job. But each one of those barriers has got holes in it because it's developed and run and managed by individuals. So when those holes come together, we end up with accidents. And it's very difficult to know in real time what's likely to happen back. So what we want to do is try and plug these holes. But we've got to understand that there are lots of things that lead us to behave in what appears to be irrational terms. So if I go to the point of any system, a dive business, we don't know where the accident line is, that red line that's on the left-hand side. If we cross that, we have an accident. But if I don't know where that red line is, I'm going to be sort of fumbling around trying to find out where it is. The other two lines are quite clear. I don't have enough money and I don't have enough people. So if we have too much work, we go, we don't have enough people, well, we can't get the work done, or we don't have, we go bust. So what we do is we drive our behaviors towards unsafety on the left-hand side. And we don't know where it is, so we build an error margin is. Wet finger in the air. I think that's safe. That'll do. I think we can manage that. We'll take it as a risk. Those sorts of things are said often because we don't know where that point is. And the same thing from saving money. But then you get people like me and Mornay and others from Dan and the safety programs that are out there that are trying to push people back from that risk. Now, diving is an inherently risky activity. And divers are typically poor money-wise. They're quite tight. They won't spend it, although they'll spend it on some things, but not others, which is a bit odd at times. And often we're time poor as well. We don't have enough time to do things. So what happens is we end up having our operating point right next to the accident line, because that's where I can get my biggest bang for buck. I'm going to be the most efficient in time and efficient in money, and then I can get my stuff done over there. But you don't know where the edge of the line is, and so often we step over it and we get a close call. We're like, oh, but we don't share those stories because we're not very good at that. So what we need to do is look not just at the sharp end, which is the bottom of the vertical piece on the left-hand side, which is this work and what happens. Actually, we need to look at how the people are trained, their competencies, the equipment design, what sort of policies, regulations, laws are in place. Because what happens is they flow down and that shapes what we do. And then we have feedback that goes up the right-hand side of that line that says, this isn't working or that's working. And often when things go wrong, more control comes down. Now, this guy, Jens Rasmussen, put together these two models. And the one on the right-hand side shows that these aren't linear cause and effect, they're relationships. So the stuff that might have happened at the company management in terms of cost saving or scheduling or hiring processes if you're in a dive center, or can you actually maintain the competencies of your instructors other than just teaching? And then we end up with what happens on the day until we end up with the accident as a line, as a box in that line near the bottom. And when you start to realize that this is about relationships, you will start to see key factors that are going on. And it's this need to look bigger. And that's really what we're talking about in this paper that I put together, and it works as well in the diving space, is outcomes are a function of these four different things. Technical skills, that's what most diver training programs are about. Propulsion, buoyancy, line laying, using an SMB, trim, using a rebreather. It's all about the technical skill acquisition. The other bits don't necessarily have the same weight or importance. So what's the environment like? What's it? Temperature, physical environment, social environment, cultural environment. What's it like? Is it easy to do the right thing or harder to do the wrong thing? Is it the task well designed? And I pick on Discover Scuba Diver here because it's an easy one. You can take 4 divers with you, but you've got to have direct control. Wait a minute, how do I have direct control of 4 divers at any one time? I have 2 hands, plus I've got to sort my own buoyancy out. Oh yeah, well, you take another diver with you. Yeah, you can do, but that costs money. The standards say 4. Okay, lots of people say I'll do 1-on-1 because they realize the standards don't work. Randomness versus lucky is, it might be you've got a PFO. You might have a health issue that you don't know about. At a population level, it's randomness. If it happens to you, it's 1 or nothing. It's a link. You're either going to get it or not. And then the bit at the bottom of these non-technical skills: decision-making, situational awareness, good communications. We need, when things go wrong in terms of accidents and incidents, we need to look at all of these bits. So what I'm going to talk about now is that was, how we build an event, how adverse events occur. Now I'm going to talk about a general process, and I'll run through this quite quickly because I'm going to focus on 2 areas. And this framework, you won't be able to read the bits in the boxes in the middle. And actually, I had to drop one off the end because I couldn't make it, much smaller than that. But I'm going to zoom through each one of those and blow the box up as it goes along. But this bit in the middle is what happens when an adverse event occurs. So we've got a diver's had the unintended outcome. They know they've had something go wrong and they want to submit the report. So that there is some level of education that's needed there that says, what's an incident and how do I report it? They know where to submit that report to. And at the moment, there isn't a simple place. There are global bodies out there, but there's nobody independent. And lots of the organizations is very localized. They submit a report in a timely manner. Well, what does timely mean? That's another piece to consider. The longer you leave something, the memory will fade. And the memories we have, they're not captured like cameras. They are stored, and when you recall it, think it over, and you put it back in your brain, you corrupt it. So the more recall and replay and restore, the more corruptions that happen. So when people go, oh, they changed their story from what they wrote down a year ago, that does not surprise me, because people are not going to remember that. The organization acknowledges the report. So they've said, thanks very much for this. We'll get back to you. That often doesn't happen. They process that report into the system. So they start with a basic categorization. They look at what happened, and then they start to do an investigation. And I've just put investigate because there isn't another word that I can find that matches this. And they start to look into it. There is no structured format for this in the diving industry. There's no standardized framework other than the one that Denoble and others put together in 2008, those triggers and disabling agents and injuries. But that's an outcome thing. It's not a causal factor. So there isn't a framework to look at this. So we haven't got a way of quantitatively allocating data. Then we look at, okay, we've captured this. We've looked at it. We've understood how it occurred as best we can. We're here to educate people. What is it that we need to put together? And those are potential learning products. Now, a learning product could be just a blog post. It could be a short video. It could be a report. It could be a change to the training program. Each one of the stakeholders in the system has a slightly different need. So if you publish a flat report of X pages, it's probably irrelevant. Most of that's irrelevant to many people. So what's the purpose of the learning product? They produce them, they disseminate them. And because we've created a learning culture and an informed culture, the users, the diving community, the divers, the instructors, the dive centers, the instructor trainers, the lawyers, the insurance companies, they take those on board, they consume them, and then we influence some change that's going on. All of those boxes there have got some dependencies and things that need to happen, and they are often missing. And that's the purpose of this research bit. So what I'm going to look at now in the next few slides are these 2 bits here: investigate the unintended outcome, and they analyze it against some sort of framework. Now, questions to consider if you're ever involved in anything like this: start by understanding normal. Accidents happen as deviations from normal, not as deviations from rules directly. Now, the rules might be normal, but in many cases they're not, because the rules have had to be adapted to the situation. So there's a bunch of questions here to consider. What does normal look like? Questions that I ask when I go to places is what works and what sucks? What makes it hard to do what you're supposed to do? And it could be time pressures, it could be layout, it could be money. Understand what those are. What are the shortcuts or the trade-offs that have to be taken? Now people go, oh, I don't make those. Yes, you do. There are always trade-offs within a system because there is never enough resource to do things. The instructions you have are always incomplete. You will always finish the design. The pressures, where do they come from? What do you get rewarded or punished for? Now, the diving industry rewards instructors for the number of certifications they issue each year. That's great. That's a quantity reward. What about quality? Does anybody reward for quality? Not really. Normally, actually, it's punished because it takes you longer to run a quality course than it does a quick course. And because everybody's under the same standards, under the Recreational Scuba Training Council, then a course is a course, when actually it's not. And then the bit about psychological safety and just culture is what happens when people make mistakes or break rules around here? Is it a punitive environment where people get punished? Or is it a learning environment where we can build on those? And that's really what this building block process is about. Work is imagined. That's the stuff that people have in their ideas about putting something together, a training program. Then you document it, you codify it, you write it down. Then you give it to people. And depending on whether or not you've got a just culture or whether or not you've got a punitive punishment-based culture, this is the responses. If you've got a punitive approach, you go to the person and say, how do you do your job? And they will tell you as per the book, because they know they're going to get into trouble if it's not like that. But if you have a just, psychologically safe environment and you say to somebody, how do you do your job? What's difficult? What sucks? How would you make it better? They will tell you exactly what it is. And there are some feedback loops that sit within this. That gap between work as done and work as prescribed is the risk that exists for divers, instructors, dive centers. Because if the proverbial hits the fan, people are going to look at work as prescribed, what's written down, not, well, as the gap between work as prescribed and work as done. They will be looking for non-compliance. So other bits then, so if we're trying to find the gap between work as imagined and work as done. These are some topics, some topics to consider under this heading of Intercom, this framework. Looking about the individual, some subheadings there. What about their non-technical skills? And there's a framework that I use during my training called a behavioral marker scheme, which says what good looks like. And I'm more than happy to post a summary of that. I'll send it to Mornay and he can put the links in the YouTube and the email that goes out. Technical skills, currencies, competencies, experience. Just because somebody is qualified to do something, it doesn't mean that they're competent to do it. And hearing the stories about how some people get qualified to go diving, including myself, my first, my final dive on my open water class, I went to fill in 24 meters because that's the dive the depth we dived to, and we should have been only 18. And the instructor said to me, no, you can't write 24 meters in because that's deeper than we're allowed. You got to write 18. Okay. Didn't know any bit different, so understanding that just because you've got a qualification, it doesn't mean that you actually are competent. Looking at, were people lucky? What was the stuff that was really unexpected? PFOs, people have about 25% of the population have a PFO. It's not the cause of DCS, but it is a big risk factor that's there. But a significant number of people don't know they've got it. So is it a factor that's there? And then this is the big driver, context, looking at the physical, social environments that are there, peer pressures, what are the error-producing conditions, what's going to happen what happened that made it more likely for the errors to occur? What's changed from normal? Because people manage risk all the time, dynamically and adaptively. What's changed? Because that's the bit that we should be looking at. And moving on from there to pick those pieces up. So we go back to that learning opportunity number one, which was the Rebreather class. And what I would say, Mornay, you can put this in the chat window as thehumandiver.com/if only is the documentary for this. And that's what an axis map or an overview of what that looks like. So we've got on the left-hand side, we've got, I say, government policy and budgeting, regulatory bodies, company management, technical and operational management, physical process and actor activities, and then equipment and surroundings. And what I did was I went through the video, having with some other stuff as well, because I did the research for this, and then put these bits in here. There are more factors than I could fit on this table. And actually the table should be, or the framework should be done in a vertical format, not a landscape, but that's the presentational piece. But this is what we're looking at, is the relationships that exist between the different levels. And, you know, on the right-hand side, hypoxia, that's in effect the outcome. If we look at this other opportunity, which was a open water diver, these are all the factors that went into this situation as well. So there were lots of things that happened, because you could just easily go, man, why did she break that 18-minute decompression? Well, part of the reason is because her guide said, break it, because he said that computer is overly conservative. My computer is clear. Off you go. And so actually they'd got bent. That diver had got bent on the second dive on the day, and then had done 2 more dives, and it was a 4th dive where she got seriously injured. So there are a whole bunch of factors here that drew out of the narrative that I picked out of the conversation that was online. So you can see that there are multiple things that need to be considered, and there isn't a framework, there isn't the training in the industry, and that's something that I'm trying to address at the start of next year. So in terms of parting thoughts, the difference between a safe and an unsafe organization lies not in how many incidents it has, but in how honestly it deals with the incidents that it does have. And this came up in a conversation online yesterday and today. We haven't had a reportable incident in 30 years. They must be really safe. No, because there's going to be lots of things. You can shape that by closely defining what a reportable incident is. Deepwater Horizon, the crew on board that were getting awards for no reportable incidents in the 3 years prior to that event. So they were dealing with typical slips, trips, falls, reportable incidents, and they weren't looking at the risk that was being developed in terms of the financial management of the organizations, and that this was a super risky hole that they were trying to drill. And people were really surprised that they managed to get it done in the time, although it was late, but then it all went horribly wrong. And the other bit is from myself, for learning, we have to understand the relationships within the system and how they influence behaviors and actions. Focusing on an individual or organizational blame or attribution seriously limits learning. You can learn or blame, you can't do both, because the data that you would want to use for learning is the same sort of stuff that would go into blaming. Accountability, and I'm going to put a blog together this weekend about it, which is going to be about they need to be held accountable. You can have 2 sorts of accountability. You can have forward-looking, so people can tell their account how it made sense and what they would do differently to create the change. Or we can have backwards accountability, where you find somebody to blame and you turn around and say, they should have done that, they should have done that, and they should have done that. And the backwards one rarely leads to change, because we'll find ways to do it. Accountability also exists at different levels, from a legal, a professional, a hierarchical, or a political framework. And the boundaries between those are not always clear. So the takeaways: try to obtain multiple perspectives, get different views. If you've got 5 people, there will be a truth, whatever that is, and then you'll have 5 different truths. If you have 5 stories exactly the same, there's collusion, because people will always see slightly different things. Bring those to the conversation. Be curious, not judgmental. It's really hard to suspend critical judgment. We will automatically look at something, our biased view, and go, oh, that's what's happened. I have it. But what I do is I keep that internal voice to myself, and then sit there going, yep, I've just recognized I've jumped into that false view. How does it make sense? Put myself in their shoes. What was the context? What were the drivers? The other thing to consider is, if you go looking for a medical issue, you'll probably find one. If you go looking for an equipment issue, you'll probably find one. If you go looking for poor instruction, you'll probably find one. So what you look for is what you'll find. So have an open mind about a systems view and not just an individual bit. We create or choose causes. We don't find them. It's our lens that focusing on this. And the bit about language matters. One that I often talk about now, the difference between Anglo-Saxon and Spanish language interpretation of an adverse event. So research project was done and they had a box which had some pins, drawing pins in it. And then they had a person went to put a balloon in the box and the balloon popped. So they showed two different groups of individuals and asked them to describe what was going on. The Anglo-Saxon view was the person popped the balloon when they put it in the box. The Spanish view was the balloon popped when it was put in the box. And the subtle difference there can make all the difference when it comes to understanding an event. So be careful on the language you use. Accidents and safety are both emergent properties of a system. We only know when safety is missing when we end up with an adverse event. And it comes all of these things together. We don't have linear cause and effect. And the easy one is say, yeah, I can find a root cause for an accident. Okay, if accidents and safe and success comes from the same point, what's the root cause of success? That's a bit hard. And the final bit is we're not linear. We don't do cause and effect. We can't reproduce exactly what's going on. We are often irrational in how we go about things. And as long as we can recognize that there is local or bounded rationality towards what's going on, then actually we've got a better chance of understanding how it made sense for those people to do what they did. Some resources for you. Under Pressure is my book, which you can get from the Human Diver website. The others, Field Guide to Understanding Human Error, really down-to-earth book about understanding, as it says there, human error. A couple of documents you can get online. The Learning Review Guide from the US Forest Service, brilliant way of learning, doing learning reviews. And then the white paper from the Chartered Institute of Ergonomics and Human Factors. And if you want to learn all about work as done and work as imagined, go and have a look at Steve Shorrock's stuff on humanistic systems. And that is the end of it. So happy to take questions and see what we can do.
Well, thank you very much, Gareth. There, we've got one from Rich. It's on the screen. I don't know if you can see it.
I can. So thanks for another great talk. I've been a fan for some time. Question is, what can I specifically be doing differently as a very part-time instructor for a small dive shop? Great question. So that's quite an open-ended bit. Are you talking about learning from unintended outcomes, or are you talking about just general human factors stuff? Or what? How many people are in your dive shop?
Yeah, so
you can't do the voice bit. Sorry.
No, that's fine. I'm sure Rich will answer. There's just a bit of lag sometimes between the stream.
Of course, yeah.
While we're waiting for Rich to answer, we've got just a thank you there from Dave. For a great webinar, informative as usual. So thank you for that.
Thanks, Jakob, as well.
Yeah, it's very nice. Yeah. Let's see if Rich gets back to us. Yeah. Anyways.
Yeah. So the thing about human factors and the stuff that I bring is, and the reason why I'm asking Rich specifically the specific questions is because it changes the answer. A lot of this stuff is general in nature and specific in application. So the first thing I would say, Rich, 12 people, start running debriefs. That's probably the easiest thing you can do. So if you go to thehumandiver.com/debrief, but you've probably been there already, start running those. And you will start to learn stuff that's going on. And you can improve how you as the instructors operate as a team, as within the dive shop. And with your students. And one of the ways, how can I be providing a better experience for my students and customers? So linked in with that debrief, the second item in that debrief says, this is something that I didn't do quite right, or I made a mistake. I create some vulnerability. And then you go through another bit of a framework, and then you can ask them how they can improve. And so there's bits that says, what did I do well and why? What do I need to improve on and how? What does the team do well and why? What does the team need to improve on and how? And so that is thanks very much. That's how you can provide a better experience for your students and customers, is because you can get them to learn how to debrief themselves when they go diving themselves. And you can create trust in that environment by talking about your own fallibility and not, instructors are held on this pedestal of excellence, the same as surgeons are, but you're all human too. You all make mistakes. And if you can create that, and then there's one of my dive masters, I wrote a blog just recently, one of the dive masters on my 10-week program talked about bringing debriefs in, and it changed everything in terms of the interactions with their customers.
Yeah, so thank you for that, Gareth. I've just posted that link you spoke
cool.
of. So it is in the comments if the folks want to have a look at that. We've got a few folks that are saying thank you. I guess they have to just hop off. Just want to acknowledge them. But here comes a question from
Eric. Absolutely brilliant question. I'd love to be able to do that. And I think part of that is there's a need to create a framework that shows people learning. One of the things to be really careful about is when you start to reward certain activities. So if you end up submitting 10 reports, that's great. It helps the learning, but actually what's the quality of those reports? Because I would say if somebody can write 10 case study reports in a year, that's a lot of work. So it's a good idea. And there's some work that I'm doing with another organization with a view to trying to bring human factors into their own internal processes, and they will get some discount as a consequence. And I'm more than happy to chat with Mornay and others from Dan about how to put that in place, because there's a huge benefit to be done by applying these concepts. So
yeah, I think let's see where it goes. Anyways, then we got Dennis, very thoughtful, provoking, great stuff. I can't see any additional questions for the moment. Gareth, just from my side, in case something goes wrong, thank you for the time, and also just thanks for everybody that's joined. We got some folks via YouTube and others via Facebook, so that's been great. I don't know if you mind, while we wait for a couple more questions and things to come in, do you mind, while we've got all the folks online, just to share that link and people can download the magazine if they like?
Yeah, go for it. Yeah, not a problem at all. I'm your guest, Mornay. Go for it.
Yeah, no, that's fine. So, folks, if you weren't online when we started the webinar, there's a free gift for joining this evening, and it's the Dan Southern Africa Alert Diver magazine. It was released over the weekend. It's a December issue, and it's packed with content, roughly about 150 pages, short and long. So just scan that code. If it doesn't work now, then the link will be in the comments on YouTube or the notes section rather on YouTube and Facebook, as well as in the email reply for the folks that registered via email. So while we're doing
that, this is a plug for you and me, Mornay. Starting February, I'm going to be writing a column in this.
Oh, that's right. Yes, I forgot I asked you. Yeah, so added to your workload.
No, thank you. Great.
Yeah. All right. Well, let me take that off. Doesn't seem like we're getting more questions coming in, Gareth. So
it's one of these things that you sit there going, "Here's a whole bunch of stuff," and people go, and how to do it. So feel free to drop me a line anytime anybody's got any questions. Just give us a shout. That's great.
So, Gareth, maybe if you don't mind sharing those links you were talking about, I think it was some blog posts and things like that, then I can add that into the email and obviously all the notes sections via social media, and they'll give folks the opportunity to look into those if that's fine.
Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. So we finish this. I'll send those across to you.
All right.
Brilliant.
Well, then, shall we call it a day, night, morning, wherever you are in the world? It's been great. I really enjoyed the talk. And you're quite right. It's a topic that you actually have to sit down and now rethink everything that you've just sort of spoke of, because it's not something that you just jump in and say, okay. And especially the whole thing about how up until this point in time incidents and accidents have been looked at. It's so different to what you're preaching at this stage, and it's about time we change it. But as Patar said, it's very difficult, and I think you've noticed this, Gareth, that people don't always give the necessary information. There's a bit of fear, I guess, that comes into play. And I think if we can change the mindset to rather share, because we can all learn from it, that'd be great. So that's my message for the evening. And for me, thank you, Gareth, and thanks to everybody.
Thank you, everybody else. Awesome. Catch up with you next time. Thanks, Mornay.
All righty. Cheers, guys. Bye.